Today, we are in Esther. It may have been a while, perhaps since you've considered the book of Esther, but I want to share with you this story and a few, I think, important themes that we take away from it. And Esther is a wonderful book of the Bible, and the reason I've picked it to share today is because it's about a lady. So often in sermons, you hear about biblical heroes, and it seems like the vast majority of them are dudes. Well, when I was writing out this sermon series, I wanted to make sure to include a few important figures of our faith who were women. So we looked at Ruth several weeks ago, and Esther's been on my calendar now for a couple of months, and I've really been looking forward to sharing this story with you and preaching from God's Word what we can learn and how our hearts can be touched by the story of Esther. So if you have a Bible and you want to try to follow along, I'm going to spend the first several minutes of our message just telling you the story, right? So that we can all be on the same page with this wonderful tale with all sorts of important and interesting developments. So let me tell you the story of Esther. The story takes place in ancient Persia. So if you think of Persia, think of like Afghanistan and Pakistan on the far right of your map, all the way stretching through the Middle East and the Holy Land in Israel, even on into Egypt and Turkey and a little bit of Europe. So this is a big section of the globe. And at the time Esther was written, Persia was, at least for what we know, was one of, if not the most dominant empire in all of the world. Well, for roughly 100 years leading into the time of Esther, the people of the Old Testament, the people of God, the Israelites, weren't in charge of their own estate. You see, in the 700s BC, the Assyrians took over northern Israel. Fast forward roughly 100 years or so, the Babylonians conquered the southern portion of Israel, and then eventually the Persians would absorb those empires into their own. So in the time of Esther, what we jump into when we tell this story, God's people are really not looking after themselves. They're paying tribute to and are servants to the Persian Empire. It wasn't a great time in the story of the history of God's people, but that's where we are. The people who are still living in exile at the time of Esther have grown very comfortable there. Matter of fact, none of these people living at the time of Esther would have ever lived in the actual Holy Land, in and around Jerusalem and Judah or Israel. They would have been born into, and all of their existence would have been shaped much more by the culture of ancient Persia than, in fact, by the culture of ancient Israel. In fact, we meet Jewish characters in the book of Esther, namely Esther herself and an older cousin of hers named Mordecai, who would sort of be a father figure to her. She had been orphaned early in her life. And when we meet Esther and Mordecai, though they will serve some incredible purposes, and in some senses, though they'll serve as heroes at an important juncture in this story, they are a far cry from what we would look at as a model believing Jew of the Old Testament. No, they had accommodated in so many ways to the vast Persian Empire and that deep culture of Persianism in which they found themselves so many years ago. So that's sort of the background. Let me tell you the story of Esther, at least the first 8 chapters, and I'm going to try to get through these a little more quickly than I was able to do in our early service today. We had a wonderful worship service with our 8:30 group, but your poor pastor did not a great job of making it through his sermon very far. We're going to try to rectify that some in our 11 o'clock service. So listen quickly, and I'll speak with brevity, so God help me, okay? Chapter number 1 of Esther, I summarize with this phrase. It's about a king who's not really in charge, right? So when Esther opens up, there's this king. His name is Ahasuerus. He's the king of this vast Persian Empire. We're told there are 127 different provinces in the empire, and he's in charge of every single one of them. But so as chapter 1 opens, really the rest of the book will follow. Though he has tons of political, worldly power, this king never really seems to be in charge. He gets played by his wife, by his prime minister, by other individuals over the course of the story. Though he's the guy with seemingly all the power, as you come away from the book of Esther, he doesn't really seem like the guy who's ultimately in charge. And that happens in chapter 1, most notably with his queen. So right into chapter 1, they're having this huge Persian party right in the heart of the capital city of the empire, Susa. And the party goes on, we're told, for 180 days. And there's incredible opulence described in this opening chapter. There's lots of drinking and carousing. This is not a very Christian type of setting, okay? Trust me. And it's in this setting, after many months of partying, that King Ahasuerus thinks to himself, you know what? I know what trick I'll pull next to impress all the boys, right? I'll have my wife come out here and show them all how beautiful she is, and then they'll be even more impressed with me, right? And so he sends word to his wife, the queen, whose name is Vashti, and he says, come on out, honey, show everybody how beautiful you are. And guess what she did? She did something that a lot of you men may unfortunately be real familiar with. She didn't listen to her husband. And she says, no. And so she just doesn't come out. And there Ahasuerus is embarrassed in front of all his friends. And who could blame her, though? Am I right? She didn't want to come out there in front of all those people and just be paraded in front of the king and his friends like some piece of meat. And so she says, no, I'm not going out there in front of all those people. And so Ahasuerus is embarrassed. And there's a sense in which he says, you know what? You're not going to be my queen wife anymore. And so though he doesn't kill her, he sort of pushes her to the side. And when chapter 1 ends, then we find the king in need of a new queen. And that's really important to the development of our story, because Esther will be positioned here in just a moment, potentially to take that spot as a new queen. So that gets us to chapter number 2. We meet a Jewish woman named Esther, and she, by this amazing work of God's providence, will become queen of this vast, very not Jewish empire. And here in chapter 2, we're introduced to the two most important characters in the book of Esther. Esther herself, she's a young, beautiful, we're told, beautiful Jewish woman, and her cousin caretaker, who's kind of like a father figure, Mordecai. Mordecai is also an important figure in the storyline here. He'll have played some crucial roles, in particular in chapter number 4. And Mordecai is a government official of some sorts. And the picture we have of these two members of God's people, and this is interesting, right? The picture we have of Mordecai and of Esther is not a picture of really faithful, believing Jews living in a distant land. You know, they stick out because they're following all of God's laws and they're just very, very Jewish. That's not really the picture that you get. Remember, God's people have been in exile for around 100 years at this point. They are very Persian-looking and Persian-acting Jews. In fact, Esther is not a Jewish name. We're told she had a Jewish name, but she didn't go by that. She went by her Persian name, Esther. And we're also told that she went to great lengths to conceal the fact that she indeed was a Jewish individual. And so there's some compromise that we're tempted to, that I think that God wants us to consider His people. Though they are His people, though He's promised to protect them and keep them, they're not really standing out in the culture. There's some accommodation there, and there's some compromise. So what happens? Well, the king, Ahasuerus, says, we're going to hold this contest all across the vast empire. I want all my officials in all the various provinces to bring together the most beautiful young virgins. And once we get them all together, essentially, we're going to play The Bachelor, Persian Empire edition. Now, some of you may know what The Bachelor is. The rest of you are pretending like you don't, right? But it's that television show where all these women try to win the affection of this one individual man. And that's kind of what happens in the book of Esther. And so after this long contest transpires, Esther wins and becomes queen. Now, though God has not been mentioned at all in the story up to this point, we read it from the vantage point of faith, and we see God is moving things and shaping things almost as this unseen, unspoken force. We refer to that as the providence of God, His in-chargeness, whether He's getting the credit for it or not. And God is so shaping events, He's putting His people into positions where He can use them when just the time is right, so that He can, like He promised, always take care of His people. Now, before we move on to chapter 3, there's an interesting tidbit you need to hear about right at the end of chapter 2. So Esther has become queen through this amazing ordeal, and her cousin Mordecai, we're told, serving in his capacity as some sort of government official, Mordecai overhears of a plot to kill the Persian king. And when he hears it, he could have said, you know what? I don't like these Persians anyways. Who do they think they are, running the whole world? He deserves it. Let him have it. But that's not what he does. He goes and he reports what he hears to the proper channels, and they find out, indeed, there was a plot to kill the king. And so Mordecai ends up saving the king's life, and though he's not rewarded or recognized in any capacity at this point, a note is made. We're told about the note there at the end of chapter 2. Hey, just record it. This dude named Mordecai helped save the king. So that's chapter 2. Esther, chapter 3. Highlighted for us there in chapter 3 is another of the most important characters in the book of Esther, a man named Haman. And we learn about him that he is a prideful government official who has a thing against the Jews. Now, against Mordecai in particular, because he doesn't feel like Mordecai respects him the way that he should. And as it turns out, he really is anti-Jew. That's not a new thing, by the way, in the world, anti-Semitism. It's been around for a long time. And I believe what lies at the heart of that is Satan does not like the people of God. Whether it's the people of God in our Old Testament, the Jews, from whom the Messiah would come, or the people of God joined by faith in Christ in the New Testament, people like you and me. And so where we see persecution, where we see anti-Semitism, I believe there are spiritual forces and powers at work because the devil doesn't like it when God's people seem to be doing well. In chapter number 3, we see this official Haman really taking it personally that Mordecai won't bow down to him. The king had told all the government officials, hey, when Haman walks in the room, he's the number one official. So when he walks in, all of you other guys got to bow down to Haman. Well, Mordecai said, no, I'm not bowing down to that guy. And as it turns out, there was a long history between the people group from which Haman had come from and the Jews from which, of course, Mordecai had come from. There in the Middle East, those peoples haven't been getting along for a very, very long time. And so Haman, feeling disrespected by Mordecai, says, you know what? I'm going to go after this guy, right? I'm not just going to get him demoted. I'm not just going to smear his reputation. I'm going to see if I can get him killed. Not only that, Haman devises a plan. I'm going to see if we can get the whole Jewish people done away with. And that's exactly what happens. Haman, through his very prideful, very self-serving, very much full of political savvy, he goes to the king and makes this request. He says, hey, king, there's this people group in your empire, and I think you need to know about them. And the king, again, the king who is in charge but never really seems to know what's going on, the king says, all right, tell me more. And Haman says, well, it's these people, the Jews, right? They're no good for the empire. They're always causing trouble. They got their own way about doing things, and I really think your empire would be better served if we just did away with them altogether. Matter of fact, to sweeten the deal, Haman goes on to say, I'll personally contribute this really large sum of money to the king's treasury if we can do away with these people. That's how much Haman said he believed in doing away with the Jews. And so the king, seemingly flippantly, says, sure, let's do away with the Jews. And so they cast a die, like rolling dice, to decide a date. On this particular date, we're going to tell everyone in the empire, if you've had enough of the Jews, then you're free. In your whatever province you find yourself, you can do away with the Jewish people. And so that's the plan as chapter number 3 ends. Well, you can imagine the Jews, when they find out about this, are incredibly distraught. That brings us to chapter number 4. As people around the empire begin to figure out that the Jews have a death sentence, the people who are not Jews are a little confused. They're like, the Jews have been here for 100 years. Why all of a sudden are we out to get them all? And the Jews themselves are incredibly upset. Chapter 4, verse 3 says that as a people they fasted, they wept, they lamented, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. And what we find really at the heart of the book of Esther here in chapter 4 is that God is going to put Mordecai and Esther into positions such that they both will encounter what I call defining moments. Do or die moments of faith. Our lives are such a mystery to us as we're living them. Trying to figure out from day to day, what am I here for? What influence am I supposed to have? Why does God have me in this place at this time with these people in my sphere of influence? Now, looking backward on our lives, right? Hindsight's 20/20, and we can see God had us places and He used us for certain things. But as we're going through them, often it's very difficult to discern what is the meaning of all of the different movements in our lives. Well, Mordecai and Esther are going to have some incredibly defining moments here in chapter 4. Esther within the palace, Mordecai outside of the palace, they begin to correspond with one another about their own fates. They're using some messengers, some go-betweens, and they start talking to each other. And Mordecai says, Esther, you're the queen, right? I mean, you don't have a ton of power or authority, but you do have a certain proximity to the king. You should consider using that to save all of our lives. They're going to kill all of us, all of our people. And Esther says, yeah, but I can't. Now, it's difficult to wrap our minds around this. I was sharing with a family during our Sunday school hour, the Old Testament, as wonderful and powerful and rich of a revelation that it is strange to us, right? We live a long time away from and a long distance from the things that are going on in both testaments of the Bible, but especially in the Old Testament. So it's hard for us to wrap our minds around this interesting fact about Persian kings. No one was allowed an audience with the king unless they were invited by the king. And so for Mordecai to suggest to Esther, just go into the king one day and say, hey, honey, it's me. Remember me, your wife? Could you do me a favor? But in that empire, to do so genuinely was to risk one's own life. And so there's this back and forth between Mordecai and Esther. And let me just read to you their defining moments. Esther chapter 4, we'll read verse 13 and following. Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther, don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews just because you're in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your father's family will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Esther then sent this reply to Mordecai. She said, go and assemble all the Jews who can be found in Susa. Susa was the capital city where they resided. And have a fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my female servants will also fast in the same way. And after that, I will go to the king, even if it is against the law. And believe me, it was against the law. If I perish, I perish. And so Mordecai went and he did everything Esther had commanded him. This is an incredible moment. Perhaps this is a moment you especially need to encounter today. Esther especially, but Mordecai also, they in one sense were trying to do the best they could at a difficult time. The best they could with what they had to work with. But we have no indication here that Esther or Mordecai were living faithful Jewish lives. We have no indication at this point that they were following God's law, that they were abiding within very specific dietary regulations that the Old Testament had provided for them. We certainly know that Esther wasn't concerned about religious intermarriage. The Old Testament had strictly forbidden that people of the Jewish faith were not supposed to intermarry with the pagans because it would water down the faith of God's people. None of these things were being respected by Esther and her character or Mordecai from what we can understand. And then, even with that compromise in their life, they come to this moment, the moral heart here of the book of Esther. Even though their lives were messy in that variety of ways, God provided this amazing opportunity for them to have a defining moment. I really should say a redefining moment. They had defined their lives for themselves. In one way, I hate to cast aspersion on biblical characters that I've grown up always thinking, were heroes. But in one way, Esther had been a great opportunist, right? I don't know if you've seen the show The Bachelor. I have not ever watched an entire episode, but I have seen enough to know this. The ladies who win that, let me tell you something, they know what they're doing, and they don't play nice. To win a contest of that nature, you got to be scrappy. And you got to be looking out for number one. And apparently Esther was that sort of character up to this moment in her life. And Mordecai had assisted her in some measure as well. And then they get to this moment with compromise, with looking out for number one, with all of that on the table. And yet God says, if you'll let me, even with all the mess in your life, I will use you in an amazing way. And lives which had been full of compromise, which were far from the ideal pictures of the Jewish faith, lives were changed that day, and God used those changed lives to save so many other people. And so Mordecai says, hey, Esther, you got to lay it all on the line. Today's the day. This is your defining moment. And Esther says, I'll do it. I'll do it. If I perish, I perish. And so Esther goes before the king, and there was this great symbolic gesture the king would do to show whether he granted favor to someone who approached him illegally like this. He would extend his scepter toward them as an act of grace and favor. And indeed, when Esther comes before the king, she finds favor. Yes, God had brought her to that royal position for just such a time as that. In chapter 5, we see shots fired. Right? Things are getting real serious by the time that we get to chapter 5. Esther has concocted a plan, and she starts to execute that plan to let the king in on the fact that Haman is actually a really bad actor, and Haman is now vying to kill off all of the Jewish people. Haman himself is increasingly more upset at Mordecai and his people, and tries to expedite the process of having at least Mordecai's death take place. And so the king asks Esther, well, Esther, what do you want? Right, you've come to me to make this request. I'll give you just about anything possible that I could give you. What would you want? And she says, well, if the king would do it, I'd love to have you join me for a special banquet. And I only want one other guest present, Haman. And so the king and the queen and Haman prepare for this special banquet. Now you got to imagine, if you're Haman, you're thinking to yourself, wow, I'm already pretty high up in the king's cabinet, so to speak. Now I'm the only guest invited to this royal banquet with the king and the queen. And so they come together, they have the banquet, and Haman is just beside himself with just satisfaction for all that he's been able to achieve in his life. And Esther is just sort of playing her cards easily, not trying to risk too much at one time. She says, King, here's the request I have. If you'll just let me throw one more banquet for you and for Haman, can we come together again tomorrow? And then I'll give you my request. And the king's just delighted. Sure, he's getting all the attention from his queen. His prime minister, Haman, is there. He's playing along. And so they say, sure, that's what we'll do. And so they leave this royal banquet. And on the way out the door, Haman, so sure of himself, is just at the height of his pride and self-satisfaction. He leaves the palace thinking, you know what? Here in this kingdom, I'm the man. I'm the number one in charge next to the king. And the king wants to spend quality time with just me and just the queen. I am the man. And as he's leaving the palace, guess who he sees? Mordecai, the one person in the kingdom who refused to bow. And so even with all of the pleasure of his success and the pride of self-satisfaction, that one person not bowing down to him really, really bothered Haman. So Haman goes home that night, and he talks with his wife, he talks with some of his friends, and he's like, listen, guys, I have got it made. I'm on a roll with the king. My career has never been better. I'm going to have the Jews exterminated, but there's this one thing that's bugging me. Mordecai, he won't bow down to me. When pride fills our hearts, Haman's a great example of this. No success, no achievement is ever enough, is it? And that was the case in the character of Haman. Nothing was enough. He had all this attention, all this respect, and yet that one episode with Mordecai just bothered him to no end. And so his wife says, I'll tell you what you should do. Haman, you have some of your servants build a gallows now, right now, tonight, 75 feet tall. And first thing tomorrow morning, when you go into work at the palace, you go in and meet with the king. You and him are really buddy-buddy right now. You go in and meet with him and tell him that Mordecai needs to die, and he'll listen to you. And then, truly, you'll have it all. And so that's exactly what Haman does. He goes to bed that night thinking everything's just perfect. Well, what happens in chapter number 6, the tides really begin to turn. As it happens, that very night, the king can't sleep. And so the king, with all of the prestige and all of the perks that he had in his kingdom, he says, you know what, I can't sleep. Have one of the servants bring me one of the historical record books of our kingdom and just read back to me all the wonderful things that I've overseen as king. And that'll help me rest better. And so you can picture the king there laying on his bed, and the servant comes in and he opens to a certain page and he begins to read. And what is the record that's read? He says, you know, not too long ago, King, there was a certain man here in your empire who heard of a plot to have you killed, and he reported it, and we snuffed out the plot and put an end to those guys who were planning an assassination attempt, and this guy saved your life. And the king's like, oh, yeah, that's a good one. I like it when my servants, save my life. He says, was this guy ever rewarded for what he did? And they said, no. He said, well, who is it? He said, it's Mordecai. And he says, well, first thing tomorrow morning, we got to do something for this guy to celebrate him because he saved my life. And so the very next morning, remember, Haman, he's got it in his mind. The very next morning, he's going to go to the palace and ask for the execution of Mordecai. But before he can get to it, the king says, are there any of my officials out in the court? Because if anyone's here, we got to do something for this Mordecai guy. And they say, oh yeah, sure. Mordecai's here. Haman's here. Haman's just come up here into the palace courtyard. And he says, bring him in. And so Haman comes in, and the king says, Haman, I've got an official in my court who really needs to be honored. What would you do to honor somebody if you were the king and you really, really wanted to just flatter them and give them the greatest compliment ever? Well, Haman's full of himself. And so he can't fathom that this person the king is talking about is anything other than himself. And so Haman really lays it on thick, and he says, well, I tell you, for this guy that you want to honor, right, king, this guy you want to honor, you should get one of your very robes that only the king gets to wear and put it on this guy. You should get one of your very horses that only the king gets to ride upon, and this guy in your robe on your horse should be paraded here through the streets of our great capital city so that everyone can see, hey, this is what happens to a guy that the king wants to honor. And the king says, you know what? That's perfect. Let's do that. And just as Haman was probably getting ready to put the robe on, he says, all right, can you go and make sure that happens for Mordecai, your mortal enemy? And we can't read necessarily what Haman's response was, but you can imagine he was not happy about that development. But he had to do what the king says. And what an incredible moment when everything that Haman had worked so hard for, which he thought was right in his grasp, God in his great providence performs this reversal of fortunes. And the promotion was given instead to the Jew Mordecai. In chapter 7, Esther resumes her plan to save her people. And so she holds this second banquet with just the king and just Haman. And while they're there, Esther comes clean with all that she had done to reach out to the king. She says, King, here's the issue. There's a person in your government who is attempting to kill, and in fact has had edicts pronounced all over your empire to kill all of, not just the Jews, but now for the first time, Esther comes clean. She says, all of my people, and me included, the Jews. In this incredible moment where Esther really for the first time in her life publicly owns her identity as a child of God, one of God's chosen people. And the king says, who in their right mind would try to kill my wife, the queen? And guess what Esther says? She said, his homeboy right here, Haman, who was there at the banquet with them. And Haman, of course, everything has just fallen apart right before his very eyes. And the king is so upset at this new revelation that he runs out of the room. Haman and Esther are left all alone, and Haman begins to beg Esther to spare his life. And in his pleading, somehow he trips over himself and falls over Esther in apparently a suggestive sort of way, because the king comes back in the room having gathered himself outside, and now he sees Haman on top of his wife, and he's like, "What is the matter with you?" And immediately has Haman hanged on the gallows that he himself had built. Gallows which were built for Mordecai, but upon which Haman would hang. In the wake of all of these revelations, the king would become closer with his wife Esther and with her cousin caretaker Mordecai. Edicts would be sent out all over the empire to essentially counteract the proclamations that had been made about the destruction of the Jews. And so the story really ends with the Jewish people being saved. Now, I don't want it to be lost on us, the importance of that. The people from whom Christ would be born, who had not yet been born, those people's existence was threatened by the self-serving, full of pride actions of this man Haman. And yet now, everything has been reversed, and God has saved his people. Let me tell you, if there's one thing that you can take away today to know about God, it's this: He always takes care of his people. Always. Do you belong to him? Do you know in your heart, can you feel today, do you believe you are a child of God? If you can say with confidence today, I know by faith that I'm a son of God, I'm a daughter of God, that I've been saved by Jesus. If you have that assurance today, let me tell you, based on God's word, he will never let you down. No matter what powers seem over you, no matter what plotting may come against you, God is always in charge, and God will always take care of his people. Now, our story today, I really want to be the highlight of the sermon, just the story of how God moved and worked through the life of Esther and of her cousin Mordecai. But I do want to leave you with one or two thoughts, themes that really come to the surface in a story like this. And really the one thing I want to emphasize is how in the book of Esther, there's this quality of God that often goes unnoticed in the Bible. Sometimes God appears to be hidden. And so I want to highlight that just for a moment, the hiddenness of God. You know, over the years, both Jews and Christians have asked of the book of Esther, where is God in this book? Now, we look at the book of Esther with eyes of faith. We understand, hey, God was removing one queen so that he could put in place another queen so that she could be right where she needed to be so that God's people could be saved. We read that with eyes of faith. But here in the actual text of the book of Esther, there is no mention of God. It's the one book in all the Bible that you don't see the word or the name or any title or any pronouns or any direct references to the one character who matters the most, God. No, he's hidden here in the book of Esther. He's hidden in the text. He's hidden in the history of his people here, right? They're in exile. They're not even in charge of their own state. He's hidden in the culture. This is a Persian book with Persian characters, Persian themes. Even the Jews seem to act at times more Persian than they do Jew. And he's hidden in all those different ways. And there's two truths that I want to leave you with this morning. There's so much more that we could say from the book of Esther, but we're limited, and so is our time. Let me just highlight this for you at the end. Two truths to emphasize in God's hiddenness. Number one, even when God seems most absent, he is still very present. In your life, there will be seasons where you don't feel the presence of God immediately. Those seasons may stretch on for some time. The Bible teaches us, even when God seems absent, he is present. You know, when you watch a movie, you see all sorts of things. You hear all sorts of things on that screen. You see characters, you discern a plot, there's drama, there's action, there's suspense. But the thing about a movie is the one person who shapes that movie more than any other is rarely ever seen in the movie. It's the director. The guy on the other side of the camera, informing the actors of what he's trying to achieve in the scene, talking to set design, talking about the lighting that he wants and the perspective that he's aiming for, all of which shapes the story. And in a very, very similar way, when God seems absent in your life, here's what you learn from the book of Esther. God is directing your life. He may be out of scene, out of view, but He's there. He's moving. And stories like the book of Esther are intended to help train us and to teach us. If we can discern the hand of God in the story of Esther, that helps us to be able to discern the hand of God in the story of our lives. He is never absent, always present, and there's one thing, we've hinted at it already, one thing you can count on when it comes to God. He will always take care of His people, always. If it doesn't feel that way, if it seems like it's been a long time, let me tell you, dear child of God, keep holding on. The story will turn around. There's one other truth I want to highlight, but with the time that we have that remains. When we think about the hiddenness of God in the story of Esther, one of the things that's most remarkable to me is, now I don't know how you grew up, but I grew up with stories of Esther such that, Esther was just this picture-perfect, quiet little girl who through her own, honesty and chastity won over this incredibly pagan king who loved her for her deep faith, right? Which, none of that is said in the book of Esther. That sells better in a child's Sunday school classroom than I think what we actually have here. But I think what we have in Esther is way more real than that. We have a woman who had nothing, who had lost everything, trying to make her way in this world. Did she make some mistakes along the way? Yeah, I think she did. I mean, everyone from a worldly vantage point would say marrying the king was a big step up, but for the Jew, marrying a non-Jew was the worst thing you could have ever done. So yeah, she made some mistakes. Yeah, there was some compromise in her life, but God did not give up on her, and He used her anyways. The more I read our precious Bible, the more I come to this great realization, whether it's the Old Testament or New Testament, the people of God really have a hard time getting their act together. I mean, from one end of the Bible to the next. God's always faithful, but His people, man, we just constantly go through seasons of we're doing okay to we're really not doing okay. And the truth is, for every single one of us here today, our lives, like Esther's life, can be pretty messy. But God uses us anyways. God can take the mess of our lives, and because of His great power and providence, without ever getting His hands dirty with the sins or the unholiness of our lives, He can take our mess and use it for good. Let that be an encouragement to you today. If you're here this morning and you think, Deek, I'm in church, that's pretty good, right? It's a long way from where I used to be, but boy, my life's a mess. My life did not turn out like I hoped it would. When I look at my life or my marriage or my family or my kids and I see a mistake here, I see a compromise here, I see a bad decision here and all sorts of fallout from that bad decision that I'm still having to pay for. When I look at my life and I see all of that, here's what you need to know about God. He has not given up on you yet, and by His grace, He can use you anyways. Here's what you need. You need your defining moment. Just like Esther had. Maybe today is that day in your life. A day where you say, God, thank you for not giving up on me in the middle of the mess of my life. Lord, whatever you can do with my life, I give it to you today. Would you have your defining moment with God this morning?